I've always loved the quiet. That's why I bought this cabin, a modest one-story place on the outskirts of Glacier National Park. I wasn't looking for complete isolation, but I wanted distance. Enough to feel separate from the world, but close enough that, if I needed supplies, a town wasn't too far away. It's been 3 years since I retired from firefighting, and life out here suits me just fine. Winters can be brutal, but I know how to handle them. When the forecast called for a storm rolling in late December, I barely batted an eye. Stocked up on firewood, checked the generator, filled the pantry, routine stuff. That night, the blizzard hit harder than expected. By the time I finished locking up my truck and shoveling just enough snow to clear the doorway, the wind was howling, rattling the eaves like some beast trying to claw its way inside. It was the kind of storm that swallowed sound, turned the world into a swirling white void. Inside, I made a mug of hot chocolate, turned up the heater, and settled into my recliner, the old thing creaking under my weight. I had an old western playing in the background, something about revenge and dusty streets. The storm outside made my home feel even cozier. Then came the first knock. It was soft, almost hesitant, but clear. 3 distinct taps. I hit pause on the movie, sitting up straighter. Nobody comes out here, not at this hour, not in this weather. My nearest neighbor was almost half a mile away, and he was the kind of man who didn't bother with social calls. I stood, heart thudding in my chest, and moved to the front window. The snow was coming down thick, blurring the glow of the porch light. At first, I saw nothing, just the whiteout conditions and the vague outline of my truck buried in the drift. Then I looked down. Footprints. They led straight to my door and back down the steps. Fresh, too. Edges sharp, not yet filled in by the falling snow. But there was no one there. I swallowed hard, my breath fogging against the cold glass. The smart thing would have been to open the door, shine my flashlight, and call out. Maybe someone was lost, maybe they needed help. But something held me back. The prints were wrong. They didn't weave or hesitate like someone searching for shelter. They came directly to my door, then turned back as if the person had no intention of entering, as if they just wanted me to know they'd been there. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the wind scream against the house. My hand hovered over the deadbolt. I strained to hear past the storm, but nothing came, just the whistle of the wind through the trees. Eventually, I convinced myself it had to be a lost hiker or some dumb kid from town playing a prank. I locked the door, grabbed my hot chocolate, and tried to settle back into my chair. Then, about an hour later, the second knock came. This time it wasn't at the front door. It was on the side of the house. I froze, heart hammering. The kitchen window was completely frosted over, making it impossible to see outside. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter, flicked off the kitchen light, and edged toward the window. I pressed my forehead to the glass, trying to see beyond the frost. Nothing. I exhaled slowly and unlocked the back door, just enough to stick the flashlight out. The beam cut through the swirling snow, illuminating the yard. Untouched. No footprints, no marks. The snow was pristine. I swallowed hard. I was sure I'd heard it. I shut the door, locked it, and backed away slowly. Maybe the wind had blown a tree branch against the house. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe... I left the flashlight on the nightstand when I finally went to bed. I didn't sleep well, every creak and groan of the cabin setting my nerves on edge. And then, just past 3 a.m., the third knock came. This one was louder, and it came from the sliding glass door at the back of the house. I shot up in bed, heart pounding. The flashlight was in my hand before I even realized I'd grabbed it. I crept out of bed, every muscle tight. The hallway was dark, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The curtain over the sliding glass door wasn't drawn. I could see straight outside. The deck was empty, but the snow told a different story. Footprints. And not just one set, several, circling. I stood there, barely breathing. The wind howled, making the trees sway like shadowy figures in the dark. But there was no one there. I stayed awake until morning, every light in the house turned on, the rifle loaded and ready by my side. When the storm finally eased, the first rays of pale sunlight filtering through the overcast sky, I stepped outside to examine the tracks. They weren't just near the back door. They were everywhere, circling my house, weaving between windows, stopping at each entrance as if someone had been watching, waiting, and then I followed them. At the edge of the woods, where the tree lines swallowed the snow, the footprints merged with something else. Tire tracks. A snowmobile. I crouched down, heart hammering. The tracks were faint, a thin layer of fresh snow covering them. Whoever had been outside my house all night had left just before dawn, knowing the snowfall would erase their trail. Whoever it was, they had a plan. I didn't call the cops. What would they do? Whoever had been out there was long gone. Instead, I drove into town. The nearest gun shop was 40 minutes away. By the time I left, I had a .357 Magnum and a 12-gauge shotgun, along with enough ammunition to never feel that vulnerable again. I'd always loved the quiet out here, but that winter, I learned something. The quiet isn't always safe. The quiet can hide things. And when the wind howls and the snow falls thick, I still find myself checking the locks, peering into the darkness beyond my porch light, because I never saw who was out there that night, and I don't know if they'll ever come back. But if they do, this time, I'll be ready. I used to love the silence of winter, the way the world slowed down under the weight of snow, the muffled stillness that made everything feel untouched. But after what happened, I've come to realize that silence isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it's watching you. I'd heard stories about people seeing things in storms, the way heavy snowfall could play tricks on your eyes, the way the wind could make you hear voices that weren't really there. I never believed any of it, not until that day on the lake. I had been ice fishing since I was a kid. My dad took me out every winter, setting up a small shack on whatever frozen lake we had access to. He used to say there was something pure about it, just you, the ice, and whatever was swimming beneath. He was gone now, but I kept up the tradition. That day, the forecast warned of a storm, but I wasn't worried. I'd fished in worse. The ice was thick, solid enough to hold trucks, let alone a single fisherman with a small shack. I loaded my gear onto my sled and made the short trek onto the lake. There were no other cars in the parking lot, no other shacks dotting the ice. I liked it that way. By the time I drilled my holes and set up inside, the wind had picked up, whistling against the thin wooden walls of my shack. I turned on my propane heater, let the warmth seep into my bones, and baited my line. Outside, the storm rolled in fast, heavy snow swallowing the world in a swirling white haze. It was perfect. At least, it should have been. I don't know how long I had been sitting there, staring at the dark hole in the ice, waiting for the telltale tug of a fish. But at some point, I glanced up at the small, frost-covered window of my shack. And that's when I saw him. A man, standing maybe 30 feet away in the snow. At first, I thought he was another fisherman, maybe someone who had arrived after me, though I hadn't heard a truck or the scrape of boots on the ice. But something was wrong. He wasn't moving, just standing there, perfectly still, watching me. I leaned forward, squinting against the frost. He was wearing a heavy coat, a hat pulled low over his face, but I couldn't make out any real details. The wind blew against him, but he didn't shift, didn't raise an arm to block the sting of snow. He just stood there, staring. I looked away for only a second, maybe to adjust my rod, maybe to blink away the unease creeping up my spine. But when I looked back, he was gone. I sat there, gripping my fishing rod a little tighter, telling myself I had imagined it. The storm was thick. Maybe he had moved and I just hadn't seen him leave. Maybe he had turned and walked back toward the shore. That made sense, right? Then I heard the footsteps. Crunching, slow, measured, coming closer, right outside my shack. I held my breath, my grip tightening around the small knife I always kept in my jacket pocket. The steps stopped just outside the door, and then... knock, knock, knock. I nearly jumped out of my chair. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't soft. It was deliberate. 3 sharp knocks right at my door. I didn't move. For a long moment, all I could hear was the wind howling outside, the creak of ice shifting beneath me. Then came a voice. Low, flat. Get off the ice. I felt a chill crawl up my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I forced myself to move, grabbing the zipper of my shack's flap and pulling it open just enough to peer outside with my flashlight. My breath fogged the air as I swept the beam of light across the snow. There was no one there, no footprints. No sign that anyone had ever been standing outside my door. My stomach twisted into knots. I stepped out onto the ice, flashlight shaking slightly in my grip, sweeping it in every direction. The storm was thick, but I should have seen something. Then I heard it, a deep, splintering crack beneath me. I turned back toward my shack just as the ice beneath it shifted. Another crack, louder this time, the sound of something deep beneath the frozen surface splintering. I ran. I didn't stop to grab my gear, didn't stop to look back. My boots skidded on the ice as I sprinted toward the shore, my breath coming in harsh gasps. Behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of ice breaking, a deafening snap as something gave way. I made it to solid ground and turned around, chest heaving. My fishing shack was gone. The ice had split open in a jagged wound, swallowing it whole. Only a few wooden splinters remained, bobbing on the surface before the hole refroze over with a thin layer of slush. I stood there for a long time, staring at where it had been. I had checked the ice thickness before I set up. I knew it had been safe. And yet, I heard the voice again, whispering in my memory, "Get off the ice." I left that night, drove straight home without looking back. I told myself I'd never return, but I did. Weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I had to know. I had to see it again, make sure I hadn't imagined the whole thing. When I arrived at the lake, the storm had long passed, the surface frozen solid once more. There were other shacks out now, other fishermen sitting in folding chairs waiting for a bite. But as I walked toward the spot where my shack had gone under, something made me stop. There, in the fresh snow by the shoreline, were footprints, leading to the ice, stopping where my shack had been. And then, nothing. No return prints, no sign of anyone walking back to shore, just one set of footprints, ending where the ice had broken. And suddenly I knew that man, whoever he was, had never been standing on the ice. He had come from it. The way silence presses against you in a winter storm changes once you know what's lurking inside it. I used to find comfort in the hush of snowfall, the way it blanketed the world, making everything feel still, safe. But after what happened on that lake, after seeing footprints that led only to the ice and not back, I couldn't shake the feeling that some silences weren't meant to be broken. That some things waited beneath the snow, watching, and I wasn't ready to tell anyone what I saw, not that they'd believe me anyway, but I couldn't escape the way it made me feel. Paranoid, exposed, small. That's why, when my friend Maggie told me she was taking a weekend trip alone to a cabin in the Rockies, I hesitated. I didn't tell her what had happened to me, but I suggested she rethink it. She laughed it off. Maggie had always been independent, the type who relished isolation, and if I pushed too hard, she'd only dig in deeper. So I let it go. I told myself she'd be fine, that nothing waited for people in the snow, that I was just being paranoid. I was wrong. Maggie rented the place online, a rustic little A-frame tucked into the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. The pictures had shown a cozy interior, a big fireplace, and miles of snow-covered forest. It was exactly the kind of place she loved, isolated, peaceful, no distractions. She left early in the morning, making the drive through winding roads before the storm rolled in. It had been snowing by the time she got there, but nothing serious. She found the key in the lockbox, stepped inside, and took a deep breath, inhaling the faint scent of old pine and cold air. That's when she noticed the first thing that felt off. There were dishes in the sink, a plate with dried grease, a mug with coffee residue, a pan that looked like someone had fried eggs in it not long ago. She frowned, setting her bag down on the counter. The listing had promised a full cleaning service between guests, but maybe they'd been in a hurry. Maybe they'd missed it. It wasn't a big deal. She washed them, shaking it off. Then she went to the bedroom. The bed was rumpled, the sheets twisted, the pillow indented, still warm. Maggie stood there for a long moment, her fingers hovering over the mattress. Her mind raced through explanations. Maybe the cleaning crew had finished late. Maybe they'd taken a break before making the bed and forgot. but as she pressed her palm against the fabric, she swore she could still feel the lingering heat of a body. She told herself she was being ridiculous. She remade the bed, unpacked, and tried to shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. That night, the storm picked up. Snow piled against the windows, wind howling through the trees like something alive. Maggie curled up by the fire with a book and a glass of wine, letting the warmth chase away her unease. The crackle of the logs, the occasional gust of wind. It was nothing, just the noises of a cabin settling. Then she heard the creak. Soft, slow, the unmistakable sound of a floorboard shifting under weight. She froze. The cabin was small, just a few rooms. There was no one else here. She held her breath, listening. The wind pressed against the walls, the fire popped, and then nothing. No more creaks, no sound of movement. Maybe it had been the house settling. Maybe the storm was making the wood expand. She turned back to her book, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been moving. The next morning, she woke to silence. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside thick with fresh snow. She dressed, made coffee, and stepped onto the back porch to breathe in the cold air. That's when she saw them. Footprints, leading from her back door into the woods. She stared at them, her pulse hammering in her throat. They were fresh, crisp, hedged, untouched by snowfall. Someone had been outside. Someone had left the cabin after she had already locked up and gone to sleep. She turned back inside, locking the door behind her with shaking fingers. She grabbed her phone and called the rental company. They apologized profusely, said there had been a few break-ins recently, nothing major, just vagrants looking for shelter. They assured her the locks were new, the place was secure, offered her a full refund if she wanted to leave early. Maggie didn't leave. She should have. That night, she checked every lock, every window, wedging a chair under the front doorknob for good measure. She kept a kitchen knife within reach. The storm had passed, but something about the stillness felt wrong. She lay in bed, wide awake, listening. Then, creep! It came from the attic, a slow, deliberate shift of weight. Maggie's breath hitched in her throat. She hadn't checked the attic hatch. She sat up, heart pounding. The knife was in her hand before she even realized she had grabbed it. Silence. She strained her ears, waiting, listening, and then, soft as a whisper, a breath, not hers, from the ceiling. Her mind raced. There was no way someone had been up there all this time, no way they had waited, watching, waiting for her to fall asleep. She bolted out of bed, heart slamming against her ribs. She grabbed her phone, her bag, everything she could carry, and ran for the door. The attic hatch creaked behind her. She didn't look, didn't stop. She flung the door open, stepping into the freezing night, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She sprinted to her car, fumbled with the keys, and started the engine. As she pulled away, she forced herself to glance in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood silent, dark, snow falling in slow, heavy flakes. And there, standing in the back window, a figure, just watching. She drove until dawn. Didn't stop until she reached a gas station miles away. She didn't sleep for days, didn't speak about it for even longer. I only found out when she called me a month later, voice shaking. She asked if I had ever felt like I was being watched, if I had ever heard something in the snow that I couldn't explain. I told her the truth, yes, and we weren't the only ones. There's something about being alone in a storm that changes you. It makes you feel small, like the world outside is waiting for you to slip up. After Maggie's call, I found myself thinking about silence again, about the weight of it pressing down when there's no one else around. She had been shaken, but she got out. She got lucky. Not everyone does. Take Lucas Bennett, for example, a photographer who thought he understood the unpredictability of winter. He wasn't the type to scare easily, not even after hearing my story or Maggie's. Lucas chased storms, sought out the desolation that most people avoided, but sometimes the things you're chasing end up chasing you back. He had been driving through Utah, heading toward Bryce Canyon, hoping to catch the way the storm swallowed the red rock formations, how the snow turned the desert into something otherworldly. He had done this kind of thing before, found remote back roads, scouted locations where no one else had set up their tripods. It was what made his photography different. He prided himself on that. But this time, he took a wrong turn. The snow came in fast, heavier than expected, and the road narrowed until it was little more than a strip of ice between steep drop-offs. He debated turning around, but then he saw it. A break in the trees. An overlook. It was exactly what he had been looking for. He pulled off the road, set up his camera, and let the storm roll in. The wind howled, shaking his tripod, but he didn't care. The shot was perfect. Then his car slid. Not much, just a shift. A slow, sickening drift as his tires lost their grip. He dropped his camera, lunged for the driver's side door, and tried to reverse, but it was too late. The snow had swallowed his wheels. He was stuck. He cursed, grabbing his phone. No signal, of course. The wind howled louder, the storm thickening around him. He wasn't panicked. Not yet. He had food, a full tank of gas. He'd wait it out. Someone would come by eventually. And then headlights cut through the storm. A truck. Relief flooded through him as the vehicle slowed, pulling up behind his car. The driver's side door creaked open, and a man stepped out, bundled in a heavy coat and beanie, his face mostly hidden. "You all right there?" the man called. Lucas nodded. "Yeah, just stuck. Was hoping someone might come by." The man didn't respond right away. He stepped closer, peering at Lucas's car like he was assessing something. "I can give you a ride to town," he finally said. "But it's a ways back. You sure you want to wait out here in this storm?" Something about the way he said it made Lucas hesitate. There was nothing overtly threatening in his tone, but it didn't feel right. The way he lingered on the words, the way he kept glancing at the car. "I think I'll wait it out," Lucas said carefully. The man studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Suit yourself." But he didn't leave. Instead, he took a slow step forward and then another, circling the car, his gloved hand brushing along the hood. Lucas felt a prickle of unease. He reached for the lock button, making sure every door was secured. The man finished his loop and stopped near the driver's side window, leaning down just enough that Lucas could make out the pale sliver of his face beneath the beanie. "You sure you don't want to ride?" His voice was quieter this time, almost coaxing. Lucas shook his head. The man chuckled, a low, humorless sound, then straightened up and walked back to his truck. Lucas exhaled, tension draining from his shoulders as he watched the truck reverse, its headlights disappearing into the storm. But then they stopped. The truck didn't leave. It just sat there, idling. Lucas could see its shadowy shape in his rearview mirror, the faint glow of its headlights illuminating the snow. Every few minutes the engine would rev, like the driver was impatient. But he never moved. Lucas turned off his own headlights, hoping the guy would think he was asleep. Maybe he'd get bored. Maybe he'd leave. The storm raged on, snow piling higher against the doors. An hour passed, then another. The truck didn't budge. Lucas's fingers hovered over his phone, useless as it was without service. He considered making a run for it, but where would he go? The nearest town was miles away. At some point, exhaustion won. His eyes drooped, his body heavy. He didn't remember falling asleep, but when he woke, the truck was gone. Lucas sat up, heart pounding. The storm had calmed, the sky a dull gray. For a moment, he let out a breath, relief washing over him. Then he noticed something. His tires. Slashed, all four of them. His stomach twisted. He hadn't heard a thing, hadn't woken up, and then, in the distance, he saw them. Footprints, leading from his car to where the truck had been parked. Lucas scrambled for his camera, adjusting the lens, zooming in, and that's when he saw it. The footprints didn't lead back. Whoever had been out there had walked up to his car, but never walked away. Lucas didn't think. He grabbed his bag, his camera, anything he could carry, and ran. He didn't stop until he hit the main road, waving down the first car he saw. Later, at a diner in town, he told the waitress what had happened. Her face paled. "You're lucky," she murmured. "Why?" She leaned in, voice low. "There have been reports about a truck like that, stopping for stranded drivers, trying to get them into the vehicle." Lucas swallowed. "And?" She hesitated. "Not all of them make it back." There's a point where you stop dismissing things as coincidence. After hearing Maggie's story and what happened to Lucas on that frozen road, I stopped believing in simple bad luck. Too many of us had seen things, felt things, things that didn't make sense. I wasn't sure if it was something supernatural, something darker, or just the cold playing tricks on us. But I knew this: winter hid things, and when it came knocking, you either listened or you prayed you'd never have to. I didn't know Oliver Grayson personally, but after what happened to him, I couldn't stop thinking about it. An old farmhouse, a storm, and something outside waiting. Oliver had spent his entire career teaching history at a university in New York before deciding to retire somewhere quieter. He found an old farmhouse in Vermont, secluded, peaceful, just the way he liked it. It had charm, that rustic kind of beauty that made you forget how isolated it really was. The town was small, the kind where everyone knew each other, but Oliver didn't mind. He wanted the quiet. His first winter there, a storm rolled in just before Christmas. Nothing unusual. Heavy snowfall, strong winds, the kind of storm that made you want to stay inside by the fire with a glass of whiskey. He spent the evening reading, listening to the wind rattle the windows, enjoying the kind of solitude he had always wanted. Then, just before midnight, he saw them. Footprints. He had been washing his glass in the sink when he glanced out the kitchen window and saw the tracks in the fresh snow. They started near the edge of the tree line and stopped just a few feet from his back porch. But there were no return prints. He frowned, rubbing the glass dry, his breath fogging the window. Maybe it was just a trick of the storm. Maybe the snow had covered up the way they left, or maybe they never left at all. He tried to shake it off, but that night he had trouble sleeping. He kept imagining someone standing just outside, watching through the darkened windows, their breath misting against the cold glass. He checked the locks 3 times before finally crawling into bed, but the next night the noises started. At first, it was just the wind. That's what he told himself at least, but then he heard the scratching. Soft at first, almost gentle, a slow drag against the back door, like something testing the wood. Then, knock, knock, knock. He bolted upright in bed, heart hammering. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, moving along the side of the house. He grabbed the flashlight from his nightstand, flicked it on, and crept toward the nearest window. The snow was falling heavily, the wind howling, but through the swirling white he could just make out the faint shape of something moving. A shadow, not walking, just standing. He swallowed, backing away from the window. His rational mind told him it was just an animal, a trick of the storm. But deep down, he knew better. The next morning, he stepped outside and saw the footprints again. More this time, circling the house, stopping at every window, every entrance. And then, he saw the second set of prints. They led from the house toward the tree line, but unlike the others, these didn't have the sharp edges of fresh steps. They were partially filled with snow, older. Like whoever had been outside had been there before. Oliver wasn't a paranoid man, but he wasn't stupid either. He went into town, asked around. The locals exchanged uneasy glances when he mentioned his property. One of the older men, a retired sheriff, finally spoke. "Farmhouse on Black Hollow Road?" he asked. Oliver nodded. The old man sighed, rubbing his jaw. "Used to belong to a guy named Howard Connors, moved out about 10 years ago. Never said why, just up and left in the middle of winter. Didn't even sell the place. Just walked away." Oliver frowned. "You think it has something to do with what I saw?" The sheriff hesitated. "I think Howard left in a hurry." That was all he said. Oliver returned home, his mind racing. He locked every door, every window, triple-checking them before nightfall. He even moved a heavy wooden dresser in front of the back door just in case. But it didn't matter. That night, they came again. This time it wasn't just the knocking, it was breathing. Long, slow exhales just beyond the thin wooden walls. The sound of something pressing against the house, testing it. Then, scratch, scratch, scratch. At the windows, at the doors. He sat in his chair, shotgun in his lap, watching the front door as the wind howled through the trees. But nothing happened. Not until morning. When he finally gathered the courage to step outside, he saw something that froze him to his core. The prints weren't just around the house anymore. They led to the basement door, the locked basement door. The one that hadn't been opened since he moved in. Oliver turned slowly, his breath fogging in the icy air. The lock was on the inside, his hands trembled as he reached for the handle, twisting it slowly. It opened easily. The air inside was stale, cold, untouched for years. Dust coated the wooden steps leading down into the darkness. His flashlight beam wavered as he stepped inside, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. There was nothing down there, no furniture, no storage, just footprints in the dust. Leading from the bottom of the stairs to the inside of the door, Oliver didn't stay the night. He packed a bag, grabbed his keys, and drove away without looking back. He never returned. The farmhouse is still there, empty, abandoned. People say it's haunted, others say it's cursed, but no one stays past winter, because when the snow falls and the wind howls, something comes back, something that never left. Some stories stick with you, whether you want them to or not. After Oliver's farmhouse ordeal, I stopped questioning whether these things were real. They were, and they were happening more often than anyone wanted to admit. Maybe it was the isolation, maybe it was the cold, maybe it was something else entirely, but people were seeing things, hearing things, losing things, and sometimes they weren't lucky enough to make it back. Rachel Evans wasn't someone you'd expect to believe in ghost stories. She was practical, level-headed, a rideshare driver working the Adirondack mountain routes, where winter storms could swallow entire towns whole. She had seen her fair share of weird passengers, drunks, and late-night loners, but nothing had prepared her for this. It was late February, the kind of cold that settled into your bones and refused to leave. The storm had been bad all week, blanketing the mountain roads with thick, wet snow. Rachel had been driving since early afternoon, picking up scattered fares, mostly locals trying to get home before the worst of the weather hit. By the time she received the last ride request of the night, she was exhausted, ready to call it quits. But then she saw the pickup location, a remote gas station on the edge of town just before the roads became nothing but wilderness. The request came with no name, just rider. No profile picture, no details. She hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen. Something about it made her uneasy, but the payout was double her normal rate. Probably just someone stranded, she told herself. Maybe their phone had died and they were using a borrowed one. She accepted. By the time she pulled up to the gas station, the snow was falling in thick sheets, the wind howling through the empty lot. The station itself was closed, just a flickering neon sign buzzing above the darkened storefront, and standing beneath it, barely visible in the glow, was a woman. She was still. Too still. Not shifting from foot to foot, not adjusting her coat against the cold, just standing there, staring straight ahead. Rachel swallowed hard. She had dealt with plenty of odd passengers before, but something about this one made her uneasy. She rolled down the window slightly. "You Rachel?" the woman asked. Her voice was soft, distant. Rachel nodded. "Yeah, I need a ride into town." The woman didn't answer, just opened the back door and slid inside. The car filled with the faint scent of something floral. Not strong, but lingering. Rachel glanced at her through the rearview mirror. The woman was pale, her dark hair damp from the snow, eyes fixed out the window. She didn't shiver, didn't rub her hands together for warmth. Rachel cleared her throat. "Where you headed?" A pause, then, softly, "Just drive." Rachel hesitated but pulled onto the road, heading toward the town. The snow was getting worse, the wipers struggling to keep up. The woman didn't speak, didn't move. Rachel tried again. "You from around here?" No answer. She glanced at the mirror again. The woman's face was half hidden in the shadows, but something about her expression made Rachel's stomach clench. She looked off, not quite there. Rachel's fingers tightened on the wheel. The silence stretched. Then, finally, the woman spoke. "Do you believe in ghosts?" Rachel let out a nervous laugh. "Not really. Why?" The woman didn't answer, just turned her head slowly to face the window again. Rachel's pulse quickened. The snow was getting heavier, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. She focused on the road, trying to shake the creeping unease settling in her chest. Then she glanced in the mirror again, and the woman was gone. Rachel's heart slammed against her ribs. She jerked the wheel, nearly skidding off the road. Her breath came fast, her hands trembling as she flicked her eyes to the back seat. Empty. The door hadn't opened. There hadn't been so much as a whisper of movement. She pulled over, hands shaking as she fumbled for her phone. She turned around in her seat, scanning the back of the car. Nothing. But the scent of perfume still hung in the air. She opened the door, stepping into the freezing night, snow crunching under her boots. She shined her phone's flashlight along the road, searching for footprints. There were none. The wind howled through the trees, the headlights cutting through the swirling snow. Rachel stood there, breath fogging in the icy air, every nerve in her body screaming that she needed to leave. Now. She scrambled back into the car, slammed the door shut, and hit the gas. She didn't stop until she reached the first lit building on the outskirts of town, a small diner, its neon sign flickering against the storm. She pulled into the lot, hands shaking as she threw the car into park. She needed to calm down, to think. But as she sat there, breathing hard, something caught her eye. A missing persons poster, taped to the window, fluttering slightly in the draft. Rachel's stomach dropped. She stepped out of the car, her breath catching in her throat as she moved closer. The woman on the poster, the same woman who had been in her back seat, missing. 1 year ago, during a snowstorm, Rachel stumbled back, her mind racing. No, that was impossible. She turned, staring at her car. The back door was still shut, the seatbelt was still latched, like someone had been sitting there just moments ago. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She forced herself to breathe, to think. Maybe it was a mistake, maybe she had imagined it. Then she noticed something on her jacket sleeve. Something small. A single, damp snowflake. But it wasn't melting. Rachel watched, heart pounding as the flake lingered, frozen solid. She wiped at it, but it didn't move. It didn't belong there. Her breath caught. She turned back toward the diner, the wind whipping through the empty parking lot. And for just a second, she saw a figure standing in the storm, far enough away that she couldn't make out the face, but close enough that she knew. Rachel didn't sleep that night. She never drove that stretch of road again, and the perfume, it never faded. If there's one thing these stories have taught me, it's that winter isn't just cold, it's quiet. And in that silence, things wait. Some of them are human, some of them might not be, but all of them watch. Each of these people, Ethan, Daniel, Maggie, Lucas, Oliver, and Rachel, thought they were alone. They weren't, and neither are we. So what can we take from this? First, never ignore your instincts. Ethan knew something wasn't right the moment he saw those footprints, and his gut was telling him not to open the door. Maggie sensed something was off the second she saw that unmade bed, and she was right. If something feels wrong, trust that feeling. It's better to be cautious than to become a headline in the local paper. Second, lock your doors. I know, it sounds simple, but you'd be surprised how many people assume that just because they're in the middle of nowhere, they're safe. Oliver checked his locks every night, but that didn't stop whatever was outside from finding a way in. Make it harder for them. Secure your home, secure your surroundings. And if you're in an unfamiliar place, check every inch before you settle in. Third, always have an escape plan. Lucas thought he was prepared, but when his tires were slashed, he realized too late that he was trapped. Rachel was smart. She drove straight to town when she realized something was wrong. Know your way out before you need it. If you're driving through a storm, have supplies. If you're alone in the wilderness, have a backup plan. Because when the time comes, hesitation can be deadly. And finally, we are never as alone as we think we are. Whether it's something lurking beyond the tree line, a presence beneath the ice, or a quiet passenger in the back seat, winter has a way of hiding things. Maybe it's because we let our guard down, lulled by the way snow muffles sound and buries evidence. Or maybe it's something deeper, something older than we can understand. But one thing is certain. When the wind howls, when the knocks come, when you feel the weight of unseen eyes on your back, listen, because some warnings come too late. To everyone who made it to the end of this collection, thank you. Enigma of the unknown exists because of you. Your curiosity, your love for the eerie, the unexplained. These stories aren't just meant to scare you. They're meant to prepare you. Because real horror doesn't come from what we know. It comes from what we can't see. So stay sharp, stay safe, and most importantly, stay warm. If these stories gave you chills, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And if you have your own chilling winter story, drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear it. Until next time, keep an eye on the snow. You never know what's watching.